Good afternoon, everybody. Thanks for coming for this quick overview. My name is Ahmed Deif, and I'm an associate professor of operation and supply chain management here at the College of Business at Cal Poly. And this basically will be our third lecture in a series, trying to give a quick background for startups who are thinking of going beyond just a prototype and a good idea with a valid and a viable market potential into really manufacturing and having this product or service realized. And on Tuesday session, we spoke more about if you're going to do this in-house and manufacturing itself, then what kind of system you need to put together, what kind of documents you need to think about and ensure that you are having or you're going to have. And in today's session, we will speak more in the direction of if you are going along the route of outsourcing and relying on external suppliers to do the job, and at least in the early stage. So we'll speak around that point and with some topics that relates to outsourcing in general. So let me share my screen and we'll go from there. Okay. So outsourcing overview of a strategy, basically, how can you think about outsourcing? I'd like to speak first about make or buy decision, since this is almost the starting point, right? After having a viable idea or a product, companies should ask themselves, should we do it in-house? Should we think about developing and investing in our own capacity? Or should we look outside and outsource, whether a nearshore, inshore, or offshore? All these are different options. This will get us into going for a supplier. So how can we think about that supplier, and what are the supplier management good practices / documents that you need to think about, which will eventually land you into picking a supplier and getting into some kind of buying procedure, purchasing cycle. So we're going to speak a little bit about that. And since you are kind of coupled and hooked up with your external suppliers, one way to reduce the risk of such basically lack of control, let me put it this way, of your own products or the whole manufacturing process, inventory is usually a good risk mitigation policy. So we're going to speak a little bit about how to think about your inventory management, whether this pertains to your components and parts or to the end product itself. And again, in 1 hour and 10 minutes or 15 minutes, we're going to basically go quickly over a lot of stuff. And it's kind of a spread thin approach. But at any time, if you feel that you'd like to ask a question or would like me to repeat something, just stop me. It's kind of a very small group today, so we can definitely make it a very informal kind of discussion. So let me start first. And again, you're going to see there is a mix between maybe, let's say, 20–30%. The professor in me is basically out there, and the consultant is 60–70% out there. So there will always be some kind of a theoretical background or some tips that you need to understand in the background. And this is very important to build your own capacity as a manager of your own startup. But I'll try to make sure that we are focusing most of the time on practical things that you can basically walk away with. And most of these practical tips coming from my 2 years basically, or 3 years now with the SPDC, consulting with a lot of startups like you guys that have been asking about questions relating to sourcing and outsourcing and picking a supplier and all these things. So generally, when people think about the make or buy decision, this is a decision that definitely has a lot of pros, and also some cons. And it's definitely the cost element comes on the top of the list why people do outsourcing, because they can't maintain, especially at this early stage of their startup, an economy of scale. So the alternative would be going for somebody who's aggregating and getting together different small orders so that third party can maintain their own economy of scale and offer vendors like you low price and low cost for manufacturing. So this is definitely something that you need to keep in mind. And this is part of, again, will help us when we look into other suppliers and how to pick a supplier. You need to make sure that you're picking a supplier who has a good track record in this kind of aggregation and reaching that economy of scale. Part of the reason why also we go for the buy rather than the make is what we call risk pooling. You're trying to really pass on the risk of demand uncertainty to somebody else. You don't want to commit to a manufacturing capacity without really understanding the market, or without being 100% sure that you're not vulnerable for market uncertainty, which is a big deal now, definitely given the current landscape of the global competition. Focus on competency. This can also be part of the strategy why you would like to outsource. And this is where we speak about platform companies focusing on what they can create in terms of value, rather than passing on other important activities in the full value chain of the product, but for those who have the expertise in it. So you can focus only, for example, on product development, on marketing, on maybe last mile logistics. Maybe this is your niche, or you would like to be a front player there, and everything else basically can be passed on to other suppliers. And this is why we usually teach students in the 101 supply chain management courses that it's not anymore an enterprise against an enterprise. It's actually a supply chain against a supply chain in today's global competition. It's you are not a sole player anymore. Even if you try to do so, you will always be part of a team. And again, given the startup basically situation that all of you guys are in now, definitely capital investment is not a good choice for you now. Even if you manage to raise some fund in the early stages, you maybe would like to use it for other activities that get you out of the death valley, as they call it in the entrepreneurial cycle. So capital investment is definitely something that you would like to postpone. So all these things put together will make outsourcing a good choice. However, you need to make sure that you understand that no roses without onions, as they say. And there are a lot of risks that comes with that. A risk of bad cost calculation, for example. When you focus on what we call unit cost rather than the landed cost, you have your accounting basically messed up, right? Don't be tempted with the very cheap code that you get for a price of a product, but add to it all these other logistics costs, insurance cost, supply chain and delivery cost, quality cost, IP leakage cost, all these kinds of stuff. And this is what we call the landed cost rather than the unit cost. So this is a risk that you need to account for. Definitely being out of the full control of your manufacturing process. And we all just saw the impact of that coming off the COVID, and everybody's speaking about a broken supply chain and being decoupled from your upstream suppliers. So there are a lot of risks come to that. So keep this in the background. Now let's look into some quantitative analysis. This is kind of a very quick qualitative overview on the make or buy. If we would like to quantify this, and again, I found this very helpful for a lot of the startups to keep these numbers in their mind and start looking for some golden cost numbers that will help them to take an educated make or buy decision. I'd like you to quickly understand how generally you can calculate mathematically what kind of cutoff, what kind of quantity would actually create a good outsourcing decision, right? And this is what we call the break-even analysis, a very simple analysis, or at least what I'm going to be presenting is the very simple first-level analysis of it. It can get, of course, more complicated the more you incorporate other related costs. But at its very basic level, we are asking every startup to try to have an idea about these three costs. Number one is what we call the variable cost. You need to do your homework trying to capture this number, which is how much will a unit cost you to produce it, right? It's in terms of things that are related to the unit itself, the material cost, for example, the labor hour associated with that, the logistics and delivery of it, for example. Anything that actually speaks to the story of this product itself without any infrastructure investment yet. This would be in the fixed cost. So the variable cost is mainly the material, the labor hour, other overheads that are related to the production itself, and the logistics, the warehousing, the inventory, the delivery. If you have an idea, or you need to start to look into these costs and try to relate this to the unit price. We call this the variable cost. Also, in order to have a good idea about the wisdom of going offshoring, you need to have an idea about the fixed cost. If you will plan to produce this in-house, what will be the investment required. And at different scales, this investment can basically be at a small scale, at a large scale, but having an idea about what kind of fixed cost that you will endure if you decide to manufacture in-house will help you to know what kind of volume you need to really go for this decision. Fixed cost mainly is the investment in the machinery, the land, if you're going to buy something, or the annual rental, for example, insurance, security, all these things that doesn't actually get affected whether you produce one part or 1,000 parts. It doesn't matter. You're going to pay it anyway. And having these two costs in mind will actually get you off to really understand the make or buy analysis. Of course, also you need to decide on what will be your selling price, right? So how much you're going to be basically selling this product for, or charging for this service, for example. And this is basically your market price in a sense, right? That you're going to actually charge your customers. With these three basically costs in mind, we would actually make a very simple analysis of what kind of quantity will justify the outsourcing decision. We do this by capturing what we call the total cost, which is basically the fixed cost plus the variable cost. And you can see that the variable cost here, C, is multiplied times Q. If you started to get bored, believe me, this is not the whole lecture. It's just 10 minutes. I'm trying to give you some kind of quantitative analysis, and then I'm going to go into other qualitative things. But this is very important based on the experience with other startups. The total cost is the fixed cost plus the variable cost that's functioned in the quantity, and the revenue basically that you will generate by selling that quantity will be that quantity times the selling price P. If you equate these two equations together and having one unknown in one equation, right, the high school algebra, you're going to actually put the Q on one side and put everything else on the other side, and you'll find that this is the very simple equation that will tell you what is your break-even quantity. So and again, the logic of reading this equation, Q equal to F over P minus C, meaning P minus C, selling price minus the variable price, is the net profit, right? So how many quantities do you need to generate a net profit enough to pay off that F, to pay off that fixed cost? Because after that point, everything else is a direct bottom line profit in your pocket. And if your marketing plan and your marketing analysis tells you that you are far below that Q, then you are definitely in a safe position to go and outsource. If your market analysis is telling you that maybe within 1 year you can actually far cross that Q, then it's a good idea to keep in mind that you are going into a make rather than a buy decision soon, and start to plan accordingly. So this is a very simple equation to keep it handy, and it's a good idea to have a dollar value for the F and the P and the C, because it will help you a lot in even other accounting activities. Related to that is actually if you have an idea about basically the supplier cost, when they started really to share with you maybe some fixed cost that you don't have, and you don't know yet what will be your selling price, maybe you don't know what will position you in the market well, you can actually compare between the fixed and the variable cost of your own production versus the supplier using this very simple equation. Again, you're going to get these slides so you don't need to write anything down, but you are equating basically the total cost to buy with the total cost to make. And if your Q that will actually come out of this equation is less than what you are looking for, then definitely sourcing is your best option, buying is your best option. If your Q that you are intending, the volume that you are intending, whether it's a product or a service to have, is close to that Q or little or even crossing that, then making is a better option for you, will lead to more profitability. So, and again, this is kind of staging the discussion, and I know that most of the companies listening to this presentation and are already in the buy decision, and they are already going for outsourcing. However, it's a good idea to keep this in the background. That maybe you will reverse course. Maybe it's a better idea to revisit this decision and see how far off I am from the in-house making decision, because things are dynamically changing too much, and the typical manufacturing destinations are not as cheap as they used to be, and they are actually changing, right? So when the manufacturing world, for example, China used to be the no-brainer destination, and still for some foreseen future it is, but people are speaking about, for example, the Mighty Five as a destination of manufacturing, right? Mighty, MITI, and five is a V, Latin V. M for Malaysia, I for Indonesia, T for Taiwan, the other I, India, and the five of the V basically is Vietnam. So people are looking into this as the new destination of manufacturing, because intentionally China is departing from being perceived as a cheap manufacturing destination into more an innovation and a knowledge-based economy rather than just a manufacturing-based economy. So things are changing. The point here is things are changing, and your buy decision today maybe is not feasible tomorrow, right? So before, and again, this is a quick overview of a framework before getting into supplier management. Well, before this, actually, let me pause here and ask you if you have any questions. Anybody would like to ask a question, any comment, you can just unmute yourself or write it in the discussion in the chat, and I'll be happy to respond. If not, then we can just proceed. Okay, so now we are in the buying decision, right? So let's say that this analysis landed us to a buy decision, and we're going to go for that. It's also a good idea to sit back as a team in your company and understand that buying strategies are different depending on the type of product or part that you're going to be sourcing and the type of the supply risk associated with every product. And this is a very simple framework just to pass on this idea that not all sourcing strategies are the same, right? If you are looking into a component or a part that's characterized by a supply chain that's very risky, and that component contributes a lot to your profit, like, for example, semiconductors in the automotive industry, for example, right? This is a very risky supply chain, and it contributes a lot to the value of the car from a customer perspective. Then if you are dealing with this buying situation, your sourcing strategy would be more toward developing a real partnership and a long-term commitment with external suppliers, right? The opposite end of the spectrum, if you're dealing with a non-critical item, for example, that doesn't really impact that much of your profit, and it's a very stable supply chain, it's available in many places. This is basically where you can exploit, for example, your purchasing power and even have a lot of inventory that's available nearby, and you don't really need to bother a lot of the sourcing strategy and the buying strategies that we're going to be discussing here. If you are in a situation where it's a very risky supply chain and unfortunately it doesn't really contribute a lot to your market, to your profit, but you have to have it, this is basically a bottleneck item, right? So we need to think about different approaches to ensure supply, right? And as much as it's not that profit lucrative, but it is important, it can stop the whole production, or it can basically ruin your reputation basically in the market or whatever. So different products and components will have different buying strategy. So point number one so far is, will you buy or make? And qualitative and quantitative analysis can give you a good direction. If you're going to buy, not everything is both actually the same. There are different buying strategies depending on the risk of supply and the component itself in terms of its profit and marginal contribution. Okay, now let's move on. So I'm going to actually source my manufacturing outside, right? Here is a checklist of things you need to think about when you start to look for a manufacturing sources, right? And this is different than general supplier sourcing. I'm going to speak about general supplier sourcing if you're going to look for other, for example, components or parts or logistics. But if you're looking into a manufacturing supplier specific, somebody that will do the manufacturing job, you need to check for these points. And I'm not going to go through all of them, but you can see that the first couple of points are relating to the credibility of that source, right? Is that source fully licensed or not, the reputation, the legal record. And I'm going to speak a little bit on how can you dig deep a little bit behind that. But you need to make sure that you are checking on this, right? If there is a third-party auditor that checked on that, this would be a great resource for you to affirm that this is a good, credible resource. And again, looking into the pricing and checking the cost that they are offering you, the production performance in general, its reliability, its quality, And then looking into what kind of minimum order quantity. And this is a big thing, basically, you face as a startup when you deal with external suppliers. The minimum order quantity is always a point of negotiation. It's a sticky point in any contract in general. And you need to understand basically that this is part of the deal, and also discuss if you would like to go beyond that minimum order into a full-scale production, what will be the flexibility level with that, right? Response time, cost reduction, delivery options, and all these things. So these are things that you need to keep in mind. And definitely, if you have any questions regarding them, please just let me know. Also, you need the question that also I receive from startups: where can I find these manufacturers? And there's no one right answer, definitely, but there are some good starting points. So if you are looking into international manufacturing suppliers, these are very famous four marketplaces that you can start with. Of course, we all know about Alibaba, and indeed, it's a good starting point. It's a good marketplace. A lot of services are offered on that platform that would give you kind of peace of mind in some issues. But there are others also. So Hong Kong Development Trade Center, HKDTC, is also a good point to start there. Global sources also is a very, especially if you would like to go to China, they are very thorough in basically crediting and looking after those who are on their platform and on their marketplace. A global sourcing supplier is another also a platform, that GSS, you can also look into that. So these are good starting points. And again, I'm saying starting point because it depends. Are you into manufacturing? Are you into a service? What kind of industry? How far you would like to manufacture? How far you would like to outsource? Is it the full thing or basically part of it only? So it depends, but these are always good starting points and will take a lot of time really to exhaust all the resources on them. North American marketplaces. So if you would like to go into what we call near shore or inshore rather than offshore to reduce the supply risk and to improve your responsiveness and lead time and logistics, then we have ThomasNet and IndustryNet. Both are good starting points or marketplaces for manufacturers that will link you based on industry and based on other search criteria that you would like to have. So this is basically regarding, and I'm still regarding the whole buy decision and sourcing. Now let's move on into sourcing other than manufacturing activities. So sometimes you would like to even source the product design itself. Maybe you have a good sketch or a product a CAD file that you're not really 100% sure it's what you really need to do. You need help in that very upstream activity of product development. There are also some marketplaces for that. I'm sharing one of them here. G2 is kind of a platform that I know of, and people are happy with it. That will help you to hook up with suppliers who will help you during the even product development and the design process itself. Some people would like just to outsource specific components and parts. They would like to do the manufacturing either inshore or in-house. So there are a lot of e-commerce marketplaces just for components and parts, and definitely this is basically, again, a lot of catalogs that you can find out there. So sourcing mainly is usually used for manufacturing, right? The previous slide, and that's why I dwelled on it a little bit, but some people would like upstream to source even product development, downstream source logistics and others. This is, I always like to share some forms basically to give you an idea of what do we mean by supplier management and supplier assessment. So if you're going to source all these activities with different suppliers, then it's a good idea to have in place a supplier assessment system. So after answering all these questions about a supplier and you already kind of picked a tentative list of suppliers, you would like to make sure that internally as a company, you have an assessment process and an assessment criteria in place. Again, it's not that complicated. You can complicate it as you go, but you can basically select some specific elements or criteria of assessment, like quality, like price, like performance. And you start to rank different suppliers. You give a score for every supplier and you start to rank them. You need to do this, number one, because suppliers need to know that they are under an assessment process and that you have alternatives, and thus they really stand up for what they promised for. And two, you need to really be very true to this assessment process. You need to act upon suppliers who are not ranking or not basically scoring as they should score, and cut off these deals with them and go for other suppliers. Because once the suppliers feel that they whether they perform or not, they got you, you will take a back seat. I always like to also like to share with you a very simple idea of how can you assess, for example. This is, and again, this is from other work with other clients. Basically, we use a very similar template to that, where I told them, okay, let's think together about what would you like to see in a supplier, right? And they came up with a nice list, like, for example, administratively wise, they are easy to reach, they are always responsive, they have a good maintenance and support after sale. We would like to have good quality of the product, right, that we have. We have the timeliness and how much they stick to what they promised in terms of delivery, and sending the samples that we need. Cost, of course, health and safety at their facility. And for every one of them, we decompose it into specific criteria. And then we said, okay, let's actually rank them and give them a score based on exceptional performance, or good, or satisfactory, or cautionary, or non-satisfactory, or unacceptable. And we give them scores from 1 to 10. And again, we set together and put a criteria of, on the administrative side, what would you like to have as a cutoff? Are you okay with satisfactory, for example? And quality, well, it has to be exceptional. Timeliness, in the good range, for example. And we start to basically put some evaluation, cut off grades, and basically this became the way they receive every shipments from a supplier on a quarterly basis or even monthly basis. They do assessment, and they send this assessment to their suppliers and ask them to either pump up a little bit their grades and rank by doing this, and that, or they're going to cut them off in the next round of contracts. It's a good, once you are in the outsourcing field, you have to know that you will spend some good time in this supplier assessment thing. Don't just let things go without recording the performance and acting upon that performance. So let me pause here and ask you if you have any questions, any comments regarding supplier assessment, what to look for in suppliers in general. And I'm still going to speak more about it, but at least in what we presented so far. Any questions, any comments? Or any experience you'd like to share? We will have some time at the end, of course, for sharing your specific experiences, but I'll be happy to hear some of that now. Cool. That's good. Okay. Okay, then let's keep going. And again, this is just what do we mean by good, satisfactory, exception, all these things. Okay. Now let's still dig more and more into our supplier relationship, and to say, okay, if I am good with a specific supplier, and I know that I'm going to actually be dealing with that specific supplier, then the next basically thing that we need to really keep an eye on is the purchasing cycle, right? And these are very important questions. And I'd like to actually go through them so that we are very comfortable understanding them, because this is very important to ask before any purchasing activity. The first question is asking basically, where can we see your products, right? Asking about their track record. And let me put a disclaimer there without really pointing into a specific location or country, but there are a lot of scammers out there. And again, my short experience basically got me to see a lot of frauds out there, and a lot of scammers, or at least people who are inflating, and suppliers who are inflating their capabilities and trying to just catch as much of new startups like you guys as possible. And we get into a lot of issues after that. So you'll find a lot of the questions on this slide, and a lot of the things that I'm going to also be sharing in the next slide is relating to how can you build that trust and credibility with your suppliers, especially at the beginning, especially at your early entry into this sourcing field. So where can we see your products, right? Looking into previous products, asking about previous customers, will always be a good starting point. And any reluctance, any unclear answer of any of these coming questions should be a red flag and should be something that you really need to stop and double check your next move. Another question would be, is it possible to get a prototype done first and or a sample, for example, right? And this is and this comes with negotiation. Who will pay for that, and who's responsible for its delivery? But these are logistics details that we can discuss later on. But asking for a prototype and a sample is always a good idea. And I'm gonna comment later on in the next slide that even that prototype, it's very important, but it will never tell you the full picture, because you will always get a good quality prototype. The real full picture comes with the first batch coming to you. But let's postpone this for now and stick to this question. Asking for a sample, asking for a prototype is always a good practice, right? Another question also that you can throw to your supplier is wondering whether they have other clients and big products that they are working with, and even asking them explicitly, will I take a priority or I'll take a back seat? And to be honest, many of these cheap destination manufacturers are very keen at the beginning to hook you up with them, and then you will in no time take a back seat because they're looking for other newcomers like you when you were a newcomer basically 2 months ago. So making sure that this also is on the table, or at least on your radar, asking about, for example, the production plans, what other clients do you have currently, and things that will tell you about your priority and your order priority. And you will see people, suppliers out there are really different in their answer about that, right? People, some of them will be clear and transparent and tell you, well, given your small quantity, you are actually number 4 on my list, right? And accordingly, the lead time is this, and that. And others will try to sugarcoat it sometimes, but you need to dig deep behind that. The question that will always come up in every single encounter with your supplier is, what is the minimal order quantity that they will ask for, and you will always be in negotiation to lower that minimal order quantity. You will always be in negotiation about that, because whatever number they throw at you, this is just to open the discussion. And in general, I'm not a negotiation basically personnel. Definitely you can ask Taryn, our professor here at the College of Business. She's the master of all negotiations. But based on my experience with sourcing, any number that's given at any early encounter is just to open a discussion and to see and to test the water, whether from your side or from their side, right? So that quantity is always subject to negotiation, and spend time trying to lower that first order quantity. And one of the good tactics basically when it comes to the cost negotiation is, if they are not really flexible in lowering the cost that much, you can bounce back to this question and tell them, okay, if you're going to stick to this cost, at least lower the order quantity in a sense. So it will also give you kind of a latitude of flexibility to maneuver with your negotiation. What are the payment conditions? And I'm going to speak a little bit more about it in the next slide, because this is definitely something that will differ from one supplier to another, and there is a big variety of answers that you will get back. Some suppliers will be rigid on basically the terms in terms of the installments. Others will be rigid in terms of the payback period. So, for example, when you put a down payment 40%, 50%, 30%, and then the rest will be in one installment when you receive the stuff, or maybe the rest will be after 2 weeks, and then when you receive, or maybe 40% after 2 weeks, and then when you receive all the shipments, the rest will be paid. Payback period, what's a good strategy about it? All these are part of the contractual basically negotiation, and I'm going to touch on it, give you some tips with that. And again, it's just tips to open discussion, but you definitely need to do some extra thorough homework with that. A good question also before purchasing, and it's a good idea if they accept to put this in the contract even later on, is envisioning how your future relationship with that supplier when it comes to scaling your production. And how much they will offer you if you scale production, and what will be the response time and the lead time given that. And all the logistics associated with that. These are very important questions that you actually. And the more you dig deep about that and discuss this with your suppliers, the more they will be confident that you know what you're getting into, right? You're not just a novice who's trying to get some products out of them, and so they will try to get the best out of you, and that's it. But you are looking into some kind of a serious relationship in a sense. And again, please, if you have any questions or any comments or anything that's not clear, please just unmute yourself and ask a question, or just write it down in the chat. I'd be very happy to really dwell more on any of that. We're still speaking about purchasing, because this is a very important element of outsourcing. And logistics. Logistics is always part of the discussion, and logistics is all these activities that are related to the delivery and the movement of products from one point to another. And this always also include warehousing and distribution, and basically packaging, loading, unloading, of course marine delivery and port settlements, or the whole process of getting things at different international ports and all the documents. And believe me, this is not an easy task, right? And it's sometimes, and this is why it's part of the purchasing negotiation. Sometimes the manufacturer themselves, they have their own logistics provider that they have been dealing with and they know how to deal with. As much as this can be a convenient thing, but also maybe it's a point of doubt. Well, maybe I need to have my own third-party logistics who will actually come and check and pick up things and see what's going on. But you need to put this in perspective. A lot of the startups basically are very much immersed in the supplier in terms of the manufacturing and the cost, and all these questions that we discussed about manufacturing cost and quantity and all these things. And they actually come to this point and just go through it quickly, although this can be a very, very sticky point in the whole outsourcing cycle. This is why the concept of third-party logistics, 3PL, is a topic that requires more and more reading. These are entities, from their name, they are a third party. It's not the buyer and it's not the supplier. It's a third party that will try to integrate and connect buyers and suppliers when it comes to the logistics between them. Usually they are either big names, like, for example, think about FedEx, for example, think about UPS. These are third-party logistics, not just distribution companies. And there are sometimes they are just local small companies that can do even a better job. And sometimes they are very specialized third-party logistics. And they are just responsible to just clear your products from the port, and that's it. Just to give you an idea, a typical shipment, for example, a typical food shipment coming from Latin America to North America, for example, will require around 200 different documents and checkpoints in its logistics cycle. So don't belittle this part of, and it's a very cumbersome part of it. And this is why pooling all these things into a third-party logistics company will be a good idea. And another activity that you need to actually engage in outsourcing for a good third-party logistics companies, especially if you go from a small-scale production to a big-scale production. You will also hit the term fourth-party logistics. So instead of 3PL, you see 4PL. And the difference between them is that third-party, the classical definition of a third-party logistics are these companies that have their own assets in doing these logistics. So they have their own trucks, they have their own personnel on the ground to follow after the documents, or they have their own inspectors at the ports that will actually work with the local authorities. Fourth-party logistics are brokers. It's like insurance. Basically, you have insurers who really have their insurance system, and there are brokers who will hook you up with other insurance and banks, for example. So fourth-party logistics are more and more increasing in number, because it gives them some flexibility to act on your behalf and hook you up with multiple third-party logistics on the ground, so that you get the job done as fast and as cheap as possible. And there is no one answer which is better. It depends on what offer and what detailed codes are you getting from each one of them. Let me pause and see if you guys have any questions regarding logistics. The very unfortunate hidden bummer that a lot of the startups actually get tangled in. Clear? Cool. Okay, then let's keep going. Testing, again, part of what I was thinking about when it comes to purchasing before closing the purchasing deal. And this is we touched on asking for a sample or a prototype, but it's not just a sample or prototype. Sometimes you need to ask for a sample and a prototype that's tested at their location, or a sample and prototype that will be tested at your location. And sometimes the testing requires more than just a sample or a prototype. It actually, in many cases, as I said, what will give you the full production picture, not their capability to produce the part or the product, because they are capable. They have the lathe and the milling machines and all these laser cutting machines that will get them to do the product. But how about if we run this over a production cycle? It will tell you a different story of quality, and their performance in general. So your testing criteria, how you're going to test and accept from your manufacturing supplier, can be based on one prototype or one sample, and also can be on two parts or on two stages. One stage is that one prototype and sample, and then the other stage to close the full purchasing deal will be after receiving the full batch or the first batch, basically. And this will get you again to the negotiation of the minimum order quantity, right? Because they will tell you, okay, at least in order to give you a first testing batch, it needs to be maybe 100 parts. Let's push it down to 80. No, let's make it 50. And you start to negotiate with that. But the point here is, number one, testing is very important before you go for a full purchasing contract relationship. And that testing, usually a lot of companies do it at a prototype and at a one sample thing, but it's far better to actually do it on a bigger scale, a batch, so that you can have the full production overview of that supply. Questions, comments, how are you guys feeling about that so far? Clear?
I guess I have a short question on that one. How, in many cases, the first batch is typically executed after sort of the initial contract, and eliminating your ability to use that as a reference point to continue the relationship or not. I think kind of like you're almost too far in at that point. So I think the prototyping testing stage would be really critical in that scenario, correct? I guess, would you have any other suggestions?
Well, good point, Zach, and I see where you're coming from. And again, it depends on your ability to negotiate and your power, basically, dynamics in that negotiation cycle. So in many cases, it's as you said, I already, in order to receive this first batch, I already signed the contract. But again, contracts can be a living document that can evolve over time, right? So you can have a specific preliminary early contract for this batch, and then the full contract or the full-fledged basic relationship can be part after that. And again, all these kind of pushing back with suppliers on this two-stage testing will send a clear signal how vigilant you are and strict you are on ensuring quality and not getting deep into this relationship before basically fully confident that that supplier is capable, not on a sample base, but even on some kind of full production base. And this is why it's a time-consuming process, but it's worth every penny of it. And you have a lot of suppliers out there that are willing to take what others dropped.
Perfect. Thanks.
Yeah, thanks, Zach, for the question. Excellent. Okay, so contracts, again, off what Zach asked, when it really gets to the point where you need to sign a contract that's kind of a long-term contract, financially kind of at a higher scale, not just an elementary one. A couple of things before I get into some specific tips. First, again, I totally advise you and point you toward a formal legal assistance with that, right? It's not a supply chain consultant like me who will be your best aid at that process, right? And I think you will have that kind of aid part of the service portfolio by the SBDC and others. So definitely you need somebody on that legal side of things when it comes to that to the final contract stage, especially the specific clauses there and here about how can you walk away from this, or who will have responsibility about this and that, and the dispute and settlement process and all these things. Also, part of what I saw that many of the startups that would like really to crash stages and run quickly, they will actually use templates out there. It's a good idea to get some of these templates and download it and read it to basically build a background, but don't really go into a contract with a template downloaded from the internet as what you are proposing to your supplier, right? There are a lot of tweaking and a lot of customization and a lot of things that are either old or you can get a better deal of it. These templates are out there to help you think about basically what you need to do, but please don't just download it and go with it, right? And again, if you have a good legal assistance, they will definitely tell you this and will get you to draft with them your basically best contract. I'm here to tell you a lot about the technical details of it, but there are a lot of legal issues that you need to also be aware of. Now let's look into some technical issues here also that in addition to what we discussed already. I'd like you to basically also look and pay attention into the intellectual property protection things, right? And ask about what's there, right? And what's their potential acceptance of, for example, signing an NDA or IP protection. And because as much as IP is a long discussion with a lot of ethical issues, whether you need to really secure everything 100% or not, but if your value is based on an idea that's really well protected, I can tell you for sure that at least over my 2-3 years with SBDC, I saw 2 cases where this IP was actually leaked and infringed, and they had to basically, one of them actually was an ex startup here, and basically when he cut off with the supplier from China, he found basically the same replica of his product was basically being sold in San Francisco, maybe 3-4 months down the road after that. IP is important, right? And how to protect yourself is also something that you need to pay attention to it. And it's part of the contract and the purchasing cycle at its later stage. Payment terms, and again, this is based on my experience. We always look into 2 things, the payback period and the installments of the percentages, basically of how much you're going to be paying now and later on. Usually, what many suppliers would like to start at is a 50-50%, so 50 upfront and 50 upon the receival of the batch and the full production of what you are asking for. But even that 50% upfront, and again, this should be contingent to a sample and a testing and all these kind of early preliminary checks. And then also a typical payback period for the rest would be not just upon the arrival of all the production and all what you ask for, but there should be some kind of a grace period to maybe do your own testing, maybe sell it to customers and get some customers' feedback. So 30 days from the receiving date of the full production is very acceptable. And again, these numbers are definitely very elastic, right? You can push it here and there, squeeze it, inflate it, deflate it, but these are starting points. If you're asking generally what's out there, this is usually what's out there, right? With a lot of variance and variability. It's very important on these contracts before the full purchasing cycle is closed to be very, very clear on your KPIs, your key performance indices, right? What is your AQL? What is your acceptance quality level? I'm going to actually get the sample and I'm going to test it. What is a pass and what's a fail? And it should be very clear, or I'm going to receive the first batch and this 50% left from the payment will be upon passing this specific test, or this is basically my acceptance criteria. Time of delivery and penalties associated with that, inventory and who is basically responsible for the inventory in the logistics stage, for example. A lot of details KPIs that need to be very well outlined in the contract. Don't get into, again, this is why I hate templates, because this is where you actually speak to exactly what you would like to see and what you would like to have for your specific context and your specific product. It's a good idea when it comes to the payment. As I said, they don't like to go down in the cost of the unit to play with these numbers. So, okay, if you're not going to actually go down and offer, for example, $2 per part instead of 2.5, I'll pay the 2.5, but you know what? I'm going to actually pay upfront 30% and then maybe 70% upon receiver, or maybe 30 and 40 and 30. You give yourself a financial breather in a sense. Or these 30 days from receiving the batch can be 50 days, for example, or 60 days. Again, another financial breather, or maybe you're waiting for some kind of fundraising or investment coming. So this is basically a good idea, again, in negotiation. It's a good idea also before purchasing to ask for, and again, this is part of credibility, is to ask about, for example, references, bank references from that specific supplier, right? And if that supplier has issue or financial issues, you will find some hesitation there, right? And it's a good red flag for you to pay attention to. Before purchasing also, it's a good idea to ask them and act as if you have your own agent on the ground, and maybe you, and by the way, you can have your own hired agent on the ground. There are a lot of companies, I can speak of for China, for example, where good professional technical people on the ground will offer to act on your behalf as part of the third-party logistics, to go and check and inspect things on the production line. And this will actually shake a lot of the scammers. If you tell them, I will actually send my agent to pick the stuff from you at the door. If they are really a scammer, they will actually give you multiple reasons why this is not feasible, and why it's better to send you the stuff directly. Once you start to get this kind of responses, there is something fishy, right? These agents, by the way, they can act on your behalf. To give you an idea about the price, they range from anywhere from $300 to $900 a day, right? So $300, $400, maybe it's worth it to really go and get somebody that can see on your behalf and check things on your behalf. Sometimes it's a good option. Just remembering things as I discuss with you these things. Yeah, so this is basically purchasing, what I'd like to say about purchasing. Before we leave the purchasing topic, these are just a couple of forms, again, to get you to think about what kind of documents you need to have. So definitely there should be a good receiving form at the warehouse or at the receiving destination, whatever it is, that will actually speak into when was these things, when did they arrive, their receiving condition, what kind of testing, what kind of documents was associated with them, quantity, counting, and all these things. It's very important basically to make sure that you have something for this receiving activity that will close the loop, right? Because this is part of the contract. And once you start to act upon something that's missing after the receiving date or the receiving point with some time, you are giving the supplier basically some room to say, why didn't you say this from the beginning, in a sense? So a document to close the loop, in addition to the, of course, other documents associated with the whole purchasing cycle. So these are the main highlights of the purchasing cycle I wanted to share with you. Questions, comments? How do you guys feel about that? Anybody would like to say anything? And I know I spent the most of the time in the purchasing because I know this is basically where all the sticky points with companies like you guys at that stage. They are tangled in that purchasing cycle. They need to be very vigilant about specific points. And it's very important, by the way, during this purchasing cycle and negotiation, is to speak the lingo also. Be very aware of what the market lingo there, right? So, for example, the BOM, bill of material, the LAD, basically landing documents, all these kind of abbreviations. You need to be aware of that so that you don't send a signal that you are a novice or somebody who's just a newcomer, and some suppliers basically will take advantage of that. Okay, Now, the last thing I'd like to share with you before we open the floor for maybe asking you what are you guys doing and how can this be of benefit for you. The last basically portion of today's quick overview is in inventory management. And again, this is very important for if you are running a platform, your company as a platform. A company is not the manufacturing basically function. It's actually putting the pieces together. Right, you are getting parts from here, components from there. Somebody's doing the manufacturing, somebody's doing the logistics. Inventory management is very important on that platform model. And when you speak about inventory, inventory has multiple functions. Right, when you run your own mini supply chain like that, inventory is what will decide on your service level. By service level, we mean the percentage of order fulfillment. And if you are aiming at a very high order fulfillment, you are looking into a high inventory level, right? So this is why big companies, for example, will tell you we have a service level of 90%. And you would say, what? Are you letting go of 10% of your orders? And they will tell you yes, because basically for going from 90 to 95%, the amount of extra inventory need to be happening, need to be stored, and need to be actually held is so expensive that it will not pay off for this extra 5% of customers. I would rather let go of these 5% rather than holding this high level of inventory. Point here is inventory is and inventory levels are not an easy decision to be made. And I'm going to speak about that now. How can you take, again, some kind of an educated guess on what kind of inventory management decisions you need to take. But inventory, number one, they are basically your interface with the customers. When we speak about finished good inventory, the finished good inventory is basically what decides on the service level. The other forms of inventory, which is the raw material and the incoming raw material inventory, is basically what will ensure your production continuity. Right? You don't want to get into a very expensive deal with some manufacturer out there, and you just contracted that manufacturer for production, and you told them that you will secure the raw material for them because it's much cheaper for you to source your own raw material, and then they don't produce because you didn't offer them or you didn't manage your raw material inventory well, right? Production can stop for two things: not enough people or capacity, or not enough material. Don't be the other one, right? You don't really put yourself in a situation where you don't really have any products because you didn't supply raw material. And in general, supply chain stability is functioning in the inventory level in the pipeline, right? And we saw this in the COVID discussion about the supply chain breaking and why a lot of vendors failed to really step up for their customers because they didn't have enough inventory at different locations, at different places in their supply chain. Their supply chain was not stable, resilient enough when they got the hit. So inventory and inventory management is a very important topic in general when you run a supply chain, because if you don't do the manufacturing yourself and have everything vertically integrated within, and you are in the buy decision, as we started, then you are running a supply chain. Whether it's a big or a small, you're running your own platform on the supply chain. Make sure you have a good inventory management along this whole supply chain for stability. Now, inventory decision is complicated from a cost perspective because it's associated with two big buckets of costs. There is the bucket of cost related to the holding cost. This is, for example, the warehousing cost, the people at the warehouse payment, the insurance that you put on every single product at a specific warehouse or a distribution center. In all these kind of things, the holding cost per part, every single box you put at that warehouse, you're going to pay X for that box or for that part, right? The risk of obsolescence and the depreciation, for example, if things will stay there for a long time in a very fast moving market, for example. So holding cost is usually function in the unit itself. And then there's also the ordering cost. Every time you initiate an order or you try to get outsource a specific quantity, there are a lot of costs associated. And we spoke about this purchasing cycle and minimum order quantity and all these things. And these two costs are actually competing against each other. I'm going to see how they are competing against each other. And this is why what is the ideal quantity that will balance between these two costs requires some kind of analysis. Another thing that actually complicates decisions regarding inventory are actually these questions: how much to order, when to order. When to order is extremely very critical decision, given again the complexity of supply chains now and the vulnerability of many suppliers and sources out there. When to order is a very critical question. And it's not as easy as, yeah, let's order as soon as possible. This is not the right answer. It can be a very costly answer, and it is a wrong answer. What to order? So not all quantities are treated equally in terms of inventory management or actually vigilant inventory management. I'm going to see that. And where to store. Again, the distribution of inventory, especially if you are speaking about a big supply chain. And maybe this last question is not of high importance for you at this stage, but it will be, of course, when you start to expand your distribution network later on. So let's try to answer some of these questions, all right? And again, the idea is to give you the clues of what questions to ask later on. I'm not expecting that you will be expert in inventory management in 10 minutes quick presentation. So how much to order? Practitioners answer this in what they call the EOQ, the economical order quantity. And the economical order quantity, basically, without getting into this nice square root equation that can freak some people out, it's basically an attempt to balance between the two competing objectives of the ordering quantity. Right? Look into this graph on the right. You'll find this red straight line going up basically is the holding cost, which makes sense. The more you order, the more you're going to pay to hold these quantities, right? If you order 100 and put it in a warehouse, you will pay less than if you order 10,000 and you put it in a warehouse, right? As you order more, you're going to pay for a holding cost more. However, the ordering cost is actually going in the opposite direction because, and again, you're going to see this in the purchasing when you, if you order only in tens, you're going to order maybe 5 times a year. But if you order in hundreds, you're going to order only 1 time a year. So all the hassle and the cost associated with purchasing will only be 1 time versus 5 times. So the holding cost will push you to order less. The ordering cost will push you to order more. And depending on the specific value, so S here in this equation is the order cost, H is the holding cost, and D is the demand. Depending on the demand and the specific dollar value of these two costs, there is something called the economical order quantity that try to balance between both of them. This is a simple mathematical equation to help you to get this order quantity, but to be honest, it's based on a lot of simple assumptions and require a lot of more and more digging. But I'm trying to tell you that there is something out there that can help you to actually decide on that order quantity, and you will always be asked to offer any analyst some dollar values, right? Some costs. And this is why being very aware of every single cost you encounter or you're going to be encountering in your business is extremely important if you'd like to have educated decisions. Now, when to order? Again, there is a very simple mathematical equations and an analysis out there that will help you to decide on what we call the reorder point, ROP. And this is something that you have to have for every single component and element that you have, especially if they are critical elements. Right, a reorder point, the logic of it is very simple. The math of it can get complicated if we actually incorporate a lot of uncertainty and stochasticity, but in its very simple bare format, we are trying to tell you that you order when you have in your inventory what will cover you during the reorder cycle. So if you are ordering from India and it takes 1 month for an order to come from India, once your inventory hit the level of 1 month worth of that inventory of sales, for example, or production, this is the time to order. And this is why you can see the equation equal to the reorder point is equal to the average demand during the lead time. The lead time is the replenishment time, right? If you reorder time is only half an hour because you just go down the road and pick it up from the market, then the reorder points can be 0, right? Or 2 or 1 or very, very low, because basically you could just gonna actually walk for 10 minutes and grab whatever you need. But if it's coming from Brazil and it takes 2 months to get everything and clear it and ship it and all these things, then expect a high reorder point, right? And we add to this point what we call safety stock. And this is as simple as it sounds. This is a very difficult exercise. Again, given a lot, because this is basically what hedge against a lot of uncertainties. So when you tell me average demand, the demand itself is uncertain. And you tell me during the lead time itself is uncertain. So uncertainty multiplied times uncertainty will give you a compounded uncertainty. And this is why usually we do this very simple math, and then we add on top of it some safety stock. But don't be basically, okay, say, okay, if the order point is maybe 20 parts, I'm going to actually put on top of it another 20 parts. 100%, this is too much, right? And this is too much money, unless you are okay with that. But say, okay, I'll top on it 10%. So instead of ordering 20, or sorry, my reorder point will be 20, I will have my reorder point to be 22. You topped on it 10% extra just in case. So there's always that safety stock. It's a wise thing to do, but don't really inflate it that much. Otherwise, you're going to be defeating the whole idea of inventory control, right? You're trying to be smart in how much you pay for your inventory and managing your inventory. So how much to order? Usually we have something called the economical order quantity. And again, the idea is to look into the competing objectives between different cost associated with ordering and try to settle in between. And when to order, which is very important, is by deciding on what's your ROP, reorder point for every single item or for your items. And this will require information about the average demand consumption for these products. The demand can be the real sales demand or the production demand, right? The production basically usage. And the lead time. And this is where your supplier basically performance and assessment come to the picture. Based on your assessment log file of these suppliers, I know that their average lead time is, for example, 2 weeks or 2 months. All right, you have a good record of that. Questions before I proceed? Clear. We know, of course, that when we deal with big products, where, for example, you have 100 components and parts getting into that, or you have multiple products, for example, or even finished good, not all products are actually equally the same, or you don't have the resource and the time and the energy to handle every single item. Right? This is where I'd like to actually throw on you this ABC analysis, and it's from its name, it's like a Pareto analysis. It's a prioritization analysis, where you're actually going to pay a lot of attention to the very few important A-class, basically, category, and you're going to have least attention, maybe once every year, you check on the reorder points of the C-class, and D would be something in between. How can you categorize A, B, and C? One suggestion, basically, most of the inventory practitioners are doing is to classify them based on the percentage of the dollar value, and how much they contribute to the end product value in a sense, right? So, for example, ICs and chips and electronic processors are very, very expensive and contribute a lot to the price and the value of the product. I would definitely put this under my A-class radar. While, for example, resistors and capacitors and all these still electronic components, but they are very cheap, they're available everywhere, they're easy to buy. Maybe they would be our C component and something in between, right? So the idea is, if the inventory management is too cumbersome or too much really for every single component, ABC is a well-accepted practice to basically balance between when to really be on top of things for everything and when you really take it easy on others. Last, before I basically open I always like to dedicate the last maybe 10-15 minutes for your questions and relating this to your own cases, some basically documents. So inventory management will always have some kind of counting happening, right? So somebody needs to every now and then, and for example, reaching the order level, checking on the safety stock. The counting should be something that's a common practice for inventory management. And again, different things that you can put on that counting sheet, like what is the code, and this gets up to the part numbering, which is very important. Different discussion that from the beginning, as you are developing your company from scratch, have a very good, smart, easy part numbering that would enable traceability and enable basically simple data analytics. So you refer to products with their part numbers, with their name, with their type, and also with the reorder basically quantity, right? So in this sheet, you don't see an ROP. It's a good idea to add another column about when is their ROP, so that whoever is counting at the final number of the count, they compare with this ROP. If they are close or already hit it, they raise the flag, and the supply chain department of the purchasing cycle need to be kicked in for reordering, right? Another basically, again, inventory counting basically form to, again, speak about the same thing again and again and again. Counting, putting things in perspective, comparing this to ROP, Also linking this to the economic order quantity, because you can actually have the economic order quantity by aggregating similar components together from different counts, from different warehouses. So when this reach 50 and this reach 50, both of them are close to the 100, which is the best economic order quantity. Let's do that now and then redistribute these parts. A lot of things happening when you have a good idea and visibility of your true inventory level. And this is part of the inventory management. Okay, questions. Well, actually, before even questions, let me basically say that we reached the last basically thing I'd like to discuss with you of the 4 things for today's overview. We spoke about make or buy decision qualitatively and quantitatively, and how can you take a decision about that in terms of the quantity that can be the threshold of make or buy. We spoke about supplier sourcing and supplier assessment and what you need to see in a manufacturing supplier specifically, and the other suppliers out there for product development, for logistics, and what to watch out for. We spend a lot of time speaking about the purchasing, because this is a very critical stage for startups at this early stage of hooking up with suppliers. And we spoke about what to ask of your manufacturing supplier before purchasing, legal issues, other technical issues, and give you some tips and numbers regarding this. And then finally, we spoke about inventory management. Since you are an outsourcing entrepreneurial venture, you will actually be moving things around, right? Whether in the form of finished good downstream, or buying raw material upstream, or securing some kind of parts and components midstream to your manufacturers. So we spoke about inventory management in general, and the critical questions of how much and when and which products will be basically be produced and controlled. And that's it.